Hi, everyone, and welcome to our second ICOM Canada Hangout. My name is Ryan Dodge. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of ICOM Canada, and we're really excited today because we have a leader in Canadian museology with us this afternoon. Dr. Robert Janes has the longest list of accolades I've seen of a Canadian museum professional. He's a fellow of the Canadian Museums Association, a past director and CEO of the Glenbow Museum, founding director of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre. Most recently, Bob has been involved with the Journal of Museum Management and Curatorship, the editor-in-chief since 2003, and has really been an advocate for museums and as good social citizens and institutions. And just want to thank you for hanging out and speaking with us today, Bob.
You're most welcome, Ryan.
So, Bob, just want to get started and talk about, you've done a lot of work in this area over the years, over your career, and I'm really interested in how you got into this work. There's so many different aspects of museum work that one can go in. And I'm really interested in how you became interested in this aspect.
Well, I'm not sure how far back I should go, but my museum career actually began a long time ago. As a child, I was a collector. I mean, maybe there's a curatorial gene. I collected lead soldiers, natural history specimens, but my prize object was a whale vertebra, and I used it as a stool, and that was always a subject of conversation in our neighborhood. I also spent a lot of time when I was growing up outdoors, camping, canoeing in wilderness areas. So I think that those childhood experiences led me to an interest in anthropology and archaeology, and then eventually museums. And in terms of this sort of broader view of museums that I've had, I think one of my most formative experiences were the 6 months that I spent with my wife Priscilla as a graduate student in archaeology, living with a band of Dene hunters. They were actually North Slavey Dene, and they lived about 7 families in a big hunting camp near the Arctic Circle. And we spent 6 months with them, living off the land. They had modern technology. They used high-powered rifles. They used snow machines. But basically, their way of life really hasn't changed in terms of their knowledge of the environment and their reliance on the environment for the last 10,000 years. And this was a transformative experience for me because the personal and social values of these hunters stressed individual autonomy, egalitarianism, decision-making by consensus and discussion, and really sort of limitations in the exercise of power. And this was coupled with an amazing generosity and humility on their part. And quite frankly, I mean, if they hadn't shared their skills, their expertise, and their food with us, we would probably have lasted about 2 weeks. So I developed this profound respect for the Dene way of life, for the hunter's way of life, for their worldview, their values, and their competencies. Plus the fact that they've been around up there for probably 5,000 years at least. And it's truly one of the most severe parts of the world. So really, my wife and I fell in love with the Northwest Territories and the wilderness up there, and that led me to apply for the job to become the founding director of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre. And this was really the first professional museum in the Canadian North, and I think it's probably if not probably the first environmentally controlled museum in the circumpolar world. So a great deal of money was spent in those days on it because the people in the Northwest Territories were tired of the fact that when their artifacts were found, they were all sent to the National Museums in Ottawa. So all their cultural patrimony disappeared because they didn't have a professional facility to take care of it. So that's why I went up there and we built the museum. It was opened by the Prince of Wales, and it's still going strong. So we lived and worked up there for about 14 years, and then I had another formative experience, and that's when I came down to become the director and CEO of the Glenbow Museum, Art Gallery, Library, and Archives in Calgary, Alberta. And in those days, it was one of the 10 largest museums in Canada, and it was in serious financial trouble. when I got there, unbeknownst to me. They didn't really bother to tell me about it during the interviews. But I guess that's quite common.
Yeah.
Because of that, those were in the days of Ralph Klein, and he called us up one day and he said, by the way, we're cutting your operating budget 40% within the next year. And in those days, we were getting about probably 87% of our money from the provincial government. So this was really a do-or-die situation. So as a result, I spent the next 10 years of my museum career engaged in intensive organizational change. And I learned then that change is never really over. You never get to a plateau where you pause and say, we've made it. It's a continuous process. And that really is what Museums and the Paradox of Change, one of my books, it's been published now in 3 editions, but it goes into excruciating detail about that. And I think it's really one of the only truly detailed case studies of organizational change in the museum world. So sorry to go on so long, Ryan, but those are examples of important experiences that have led me to believe that museums have a much bigger role to play as key intellectual resources and civic resources in our society.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we were going through all that change at Glenbow, and there was a lot of pain and suffering and anxiety because we had to lay off 25% of our staff.
Wow.
And that was a terrible day. It was done in the interest of preserving the institution, but nonetheless there was a lot of personal injury and pain. And I started to think to myself, well, why are we doing all this? Are we doing all this just because we want to collect things, just because we want to put on exhibitions? And it made me think, and it made my colleagues think, that museums have a far greater potential to add value to society and contribute to community well-being.
Right. And let's talk about, I'm really interested more in the 14 years in Northwest Territories, and just, you were talking about the cultural heritage leaving the territory to head to Ottawa. Was part of the mandate of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre to teach museum practice up there and collecting standards and things like that, or was it more on how to document cultural heritage, or maybe talk about that a little bit more?
It actually was really all those things, and the institution was very interesting to me because we were able to create it from scratch. I was the first employee, and by the time I left that particular job 10 years later, because then I went to the Science Institute of the Northwest Territories, we had about 35 staff. We'd grown from a budget of about $200,000 to about $3.5 million, and we had a typical museum with several different disciplines in it. We had a full-fledged territorial archives, we had a research library, we had an art gallery, we had an archaeological field program, we had an education extension service, and we had a museums advisory service that provided grants and expertise to communities, because in those days, 2/3 of the population was native-born. It was either Dene, Inuit, or Métis. There were 65 communities in the NWT, 1.4 million square miles. I don't even know what that is in kilometers, hectares. And less than half of those communities could be reached by road, and all the rest had to be reached by aircraft or boat. And the idea behind the Heritage Center was truly a center. You could think of it as the hub in a wheel. And so we were the hub, and we radiated these services throughout the Northwest Territories. And as you indicated, it included everything from teaching museology and technical requirements to these local communities, to collecting, to doing archaeological field research and training local people as supervisors and archaeologists themselves, putting on exhibitions in Yellowknife, but also we developed a traveling exhibit program where you could get where we designed them so you could get the exhibit case in a Cessna 185 on floats, because sometimes only that light aircraft could get into a community. Right. So it was really challenging, but also there was nobody standing around saying, this is what we've always done, so this is the way you have to do it. We truly could sort of exercise our creativity and our imagination and do what we needed to get things done.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, having said that, it was difficult too because a lot of the standards of professionalism that we take for granted up, down south, for example, well, if you want to have a collection, you have to have a climate-controlled facility. Well, that's complete nonsense up there in these remote communities. Those facilities will never happen. So we had to adjust our professional practice in order to accommodate those local conditions. And so we were creating small museums and libraries. We were doing living heritage projects like reconstructing old technology rather than collecting the original stuff and trying to store it. It was wide open, really, and I suppose that a lot of traditionalists would be concerned about our approach, but we really had to adapt to the local environment.
Yeah. I mean, it's commendable that you did do that at that time. Before I want to ask you about the situation at the Glenbow in a little bit, but before we get that, I forgot at the start of the Hangout to mention how people can ask you questions. We're monitoring our Twitter feed on the side. You can tweet questions to at ICOM Canada with the hashtag AskICOMCA. You can also, if you're watching on Google+, the Q&A function is on, so you can type questions in there. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, you should be able to access the Q&A function through the viewer there as well. If you do have questions for Dr. James, please do let us know. And we'll get to those when we can. We also have two ICOM Canada board members on the Hangout with us as well. I see Jennifer just logged in. Hi, Jennifer. And Audrey Vermette is here as well. Jennifer Carter from Montreal. There's Audrey. So Bob, I think this we talked a little bit about museums and the paradox of change. Now in the 3rd edition. I pulled this from the ROM library this morning, and you talked about this is really one of the only case studies on changing the way a museum functions. And you had an interesting model for your senior management group at the Glenbow. Can you talk about a little bit about how that came about? And I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the drastic change in operating budget, but and how that relates to your experience up north as well.
Well, boy, it's a big story, but some things stand out in my mind, and probably in addition to Ralph Klein, the premier, calling up and saying he's going to cut our budget by 40% within a year, I was struck, I think it was on the 2nd or 3rd day of my job, and I went to it. In those days, Glenbow had about probably 180 staff organized, I think, into 23 separate departments, 4 or 5 divisions, silo-like divisions. So it was a classic corporate hierarchy. And I had a question, so I went directly to a department head to ask that person my question. And I was chastised shortly thereafter by one of the VPs who said, "There's no reason for you to have to talk to a department head. You're the CEO. You should be dealing directly with me as the VP." And right then I was struck about how rigid their hierarchy had become, because, boy, with that kind of communication, you've got a very brittle situation and a very unhappy situation. Mm-hmm. So in addition to the financial crisis we were facing, I think that generally Glenbow staff wanted a new way of doing things. Glenbow was at that time a highly successful, high-profile institution. But like all institutions, they get stuck in ruts. You're on automatic pilot, and it's not necessarily healthy or productive. So there was an internal pressure, there was an external pressure, and that led to our having to sort of go back to the drawing board. And especially with that kind of budget reduction, you can't just sort of do death by 100 cuts. We had to go back with a blank sheet of paper and say, what do we want to be, and where are we going to start? And like I said, that was a process that began, and it's still unfolding. And it was so comprehensive that it involves everything to, work design, organizational design, governance, finances, everything. And a good example, we really sort of started to look at the detail. And so we did a lot of business process mapping, is what they called it in those days. It's a technique we borrowed from the private sector. And we looked at what actually was involved when we loaned an object to another institution. And we mapped it by talking to people who were involved in the work. And we found out, if I remember right, there was something like 38 separate steps where this piece of paper was handled within this large bureaucratic organization. And when everybody realized how preposterous that was, we cut it down to, I think, 9 steps. But so we had to take time out. You know, we took a good 2 years out to really engage in that critical self-reflection and ask, why are we doing what we're doing and how are we doing it? And we did a strategic plan in the process too, and that took a good 12 months because we involved all the staff, all the board members, and our key stakeholders. And granted, it was a lot of navel-gazing, but it was absolutely essential to the future health of the organization, and I would recommend that more institutions do that. Have a good, hard look at how they're doing what they're doing, especially now with all the financial pressures.
Yeah. I mean, it is tough out there. We went through at the Rome. We went through not quite drastic cut in operating budget, but definitely some issues after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and had to lay off some staff. And I know the National Gallery has had issues as well. And I think it's an important thing. And this book. I didn't have to read this one in museum studies, but I did read Museums in a Troubled World, which is another one of your books. This one right here. And I thought it was great that my museum studies course actually brought this into the coursework. I'm not sure that many people, I don't know, but I'm not sure that many people have actually, any senior managers have these 2 books on their desks, and it's maybe something they should have. Jennifer, Audrey, I know you're just joining, but if you have any questions or anything that you want to add, feel free to jump in. Do
you want us to ask them orally, or
go right ahead? Yeah.
I'd love to, actually. Hi, Bob. How are you? It's nice to see you.
Hi, Jennifer. Nice to see you too.
I have a question about the strategic plan session and notions of convergence as one way of helping different cultural institutions to overcome the silo effect, as you mentioned, which is a real issue, I think, that cultural institutions face as they try to bring different department heads and different staff members together. But where do you stand on questions of cultural convergence and either the benefits or some of the challenges that are inherent in convergence, be it digital or many different forms of convergence that we see today?
Can you help me with what you mean by convergence?
Well, that's one of those terms that has no common consensus for a definition, but where different departments attempt to bring together their either their professional skills or their responsibilities, and hopefully produce more interaction amongst staff, greater sharing amongst collections, be those archival, material, artistic, etc., historical, towards a different kind of operative model in cultural institutions. So, I mean, we've seen it with a number of different institutions in Canada and certainly further abroad, but I think it's still a trial period for many cultural institutions who are learning and often don't go about it having taken the kind of time that you did, and this is what struck me in your comment earlier, to take 1 or 2 years to review a strategic plan.
Yeah, that's a big question, but it's really a good one, and I think it's truly multifaceted, and I think that if I understand what you're saying about convergence, bringing the best out of everyone and everything, I think it starts with leadership. And I think that leadership is much more about the group than it is about the individual. And Ryan and I were actually talking about this before we went on air. I have a real hard time with the fact that museums have essentially borrowed the corporate hierarchy and that model of doing things in a very sort of uncritical way. And I think that most museum directors have far too much power and authority, even over their own, so-called peers, even over their vice presidents. And I would like to see, in terms of convergence, in terms of the future, leadership that's much more about the group than it is about the individual. And you know, there are essentially two leadership models that we look at, and one is, you know, the lone CEO. I mean, they're the all-powerful, the all-wonderful. They're either going to fix it or break it. They get touted with success or they get fired. And then you've got the Roman model of leadership, primus inter pares, or first among equals, which we really don't recognize at all in our society. And I think it's really important because there the authority and the responsibility is shared by the group. You do have a first among equals, the spokesperson, maybe has a bit more status, a bit more pay. But our world has become so complex and so multifaceted. To put the leadership in the form of one person is just absurd. And it's not working. We just see that most of our social organizations and institutions are really struggling to add value and get their work done. They're becoming increasingly irrelevant. I think it's partly to do to their poor organizational design. So the first thing is leadership. We need to be sharing it with the group. I think the next thing is this notion of disciplinary boundaries. They're not helpful. I mean, the world, the people that we serve, don't look at the world in terms of the disciplinary boundaries that we're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. So rather than having, Glenbow had 26, 23, 24, 25 departments, collapsed all those departments, all those functional departments, like social history, et cetera, into 4 large multifunctional, multidisciplinary work units, where all these people were mixed in together to do project-based work.
This is what you did? This is what you implemented?
Pardon me?
This is what you implemented?
Yes. And I think that if it was messy, really messy, but I think if there's been any long-standing legacy, I mean, a lot of the changes that we implemented at Glenbow have apparently disappeared or not been followed through. But I think that if you talk to people at Glenbow, they would admit that there's a legacy of teamwork there. And I hate to use that word because it's so hackneyed, but in fact, teamwork is still essential in terms of the complex projects that we have to undertake. And you have to design the organization to allow that to unfold. But having said that, individual work is also important too. So you need the combination of this project-based collective work along with the ability for people to work individually. Mm-hmm. So I think disciplinary boundaries have to disappear as a second ingredient. And then the third to me is personal agency. The organization has to allow individuals to take action in the world based on their beliefs and their values and their own knowledge. And so many museum workers that I meet are afraid to do that because they think that they're maybe going to lose their job or lose their friends. But my advice is, if there's something important that you think is important, act on it. Fly under the radar. Ask for forgiveness, not approval. And I think if those 3 things, if the leadership was revisited, if disciplinary boundaries were collapsed, and more emphasis was put on personal agency, that we would have a lot healthier, more relevant organizations. Yeah.
But the question of collapsing disciplinary and boundaries is a difficult one because there's so many different skill sets across the different cultural institutions that are necessary for particular collections. So how did you get around that question? The question of retraining?
That's not devaluing the knowledge. It's not devaluing the discipline because we still need that specialized knowledge. We still need those knowledge holders. It's just how are they going to do their work? Because in my experience, every time you have a department that consists of the same kind of specialists, it becomes a sort of toll booth in the organization. You know? Mm-hmm. You got to pay the toll to work in that department or work outside it. So I think that it's better to mix these specialists up on project-based work teams where they're sharing things on a working level with people outside their own discipline. I mean, it can include educators, it can include a biologist, it can include a marketer or whatever.
Right, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that because I mean, in terms of social media and web content at the ROM, you know, we encourage people to share their day-to-day and their activities working at the museum, and a big part of the reason why we do this is, you know, to build awareness about everything that happens behind the scenes and what we're doing. And when we first started down this path, people were afraid to share that content. They were afraid they were going to ruin something, or they were going to make a mistake. And we did a lot of training, and we did a lot of that work in the head of time. But the last ingredient that something that I think is the most important is trust. In many cases, the people that you're working with are trusted academics. They're paid to handle priceless objects. You trust them with those things. Why can't you trust them with communicating online to share all of the good things that are happening at the museum? So it's interesting to hear you say that, Bob, about that trust and allowing people to run with something without checking first. Part of most of my day-to-day falls under that.
I can really appreciate that, because after a while at Glenbow, I came to the conclusion that if I knew everything that was going on in the institution, there wasn't enough going on.
Right.
I mean, I really believe in that personal autonomy.
Well,
and that only works. I mean, that doesn't mean everybody is just sort of running off willy-nilly, engaging in their own interest. That's why strategic planning is so important, because you then sit down and you agree collectively on what needs to be done. But management should never really be interfering in how it gets done. That should be left to the intelligence and the creativity of individual workers. Once the outcome has been set.
Yeah, and and it all comes back to your mission and your vision and everything. That's everyone has that in mind. Everyone's working towards the same goal, or should be. So why not let them make that happen?
Ryan, just one question. Could you share with us how, in fact, you referred to sharing these different disciplinary perspectives. How in fact, did you do that at ROM? Because that's a big organization.
Well, I mean, it really started in around 2010 to 2012. We redesigned our website. And before, the website was, it was a closed environment. So you had to have a key if you wanted to change anything on the website. And that was very controlled. And with our new website, we opened up access to all of our staff, people that were interested, that wanted to produce content for the web. And there was a lot of training that was involved in that, teaching people not only how to use the system, but how to write for the web and things like that. And at first, people were a little hesitant with putting things online. They were a little afraid. But as they got more comfortable with the platform, and as they got more comfortable with writing for the web, then we started to see a lot more content, a lot more blog posts and things like that. And
so the web was really important.
Sorry?
The web was really important.
Yeah, so that was sort of the that was the basis for our use of social media. And when I went to everyone and asked them, I said, okay, we're going to encourage you to use social on a personal level, but also a semi-professional, because the lines are blurred between that in our digital world, between your personal use of social media and your professional. So we encourage people to start accounts that were semi-personal, professional. We have a set of guidelines that are not set in stone, but are here's how to avoid some issues. We are a provincial agency, so when there's an election, we can't be seen to favor one party over the other. Those types of things. But for the most part, we give people monthly training. I meet with people one-on-one or in small groups, and we talk about some things, some issues, some content they want to develop. And for the most part, I trust them that they're adults, that they they know what voice to use, how to act online, that sort of thing, and the major issues, haven't really, knock on wood, we haven't had any major issues. It's been really great, and a lot of museums are. I get lots of emails and questions from people around the world asking us how we get our staff, they get their staff involved in social as much as we do. So
that's great, Ryan. I should mention that I'm getting quite a bit of reverberation from your.
You are okay. I'm gonna mute my mic when I'm not talking, and I guess if everyone else could do that as well while you're not talking, that'd be great. Bob, let's talk. Let's move to. Let's talk a little bit about the climate change agenda. And there's been a little bit of content in the news lately. Back in March, there was a petition that was sent around by a group out of New York. And I'll let you talk about them and the petition a little bit, but it was about having someone removed from a board in large museums in the States. And maybe just talk about how this Museums in the Troubled World ties into that, and maybe what museums could be doing more with that issue.
Well, I guess it goes back to some of the things that I mentioned earlier about living and working in the North and having to challenge museum orthodoxy and practice because it didn't really fit the local conditions. And then coming to Glenbow and then confronting another set of traditional assumptions about how museums should be organized and how the work should be done. And again, all those experiences gave me a really intimate glimpse of the true value of museums and what they could accomplish if they could somehow sort of be unleashed and made more relevant in terms of as being social organizations. And that means understanding some of the obstacles and limits that that prevent the fulfillment of this potential. And that led me to write Museums in a Troubled World, because it had become clear to me by then in 2007, I think, when I started the book, that museums have potential and they have roles and responsibilities that go far beyond education and entertainment. And the other sort of material things that seem to be driving museums, like shops and collections and exhibitions. And I was really bothered by the fact that museums were rarely, if ever, mentioned in the societal discussions about important issues such as climate change and social justice. Every time I would run into a book, I'd go to an index and see if the word museum was listed, because we're talking about social issues and social problems and social challenges, and they were never mentioned. And that just seemed like an incredible, I guess, both shame and oversight, because the museums are amazingly powerful in terms of the knowledge they own, the trust they have by society, their sense of locality, yet they didn't even appear on their radar. So I wanted our colleagues to start thinking about the bigger picture and the role that museums could actually play in contributing, not necessarily solutions, but maybe new visions for the future, and adding to community well-being. And of course, climate change is probably the most important issue now confronting our species. And I think it's essential that museums start talking to their communities about this issue and finding out what's bothering the people they serve, what their interests and their aspirations are. But unfortunately, museums have not really initiated that discussion. This discussion is now coming from outside the museum community, and you just mentioned it, Ryan, in the form of the new Natural History Museum. And this is really a project undertaken by Not an Alternative, which is a group of artists in New York that became very concerned that some of our major science museums in North America have climate change deniers on their board of governors. And these artists are saying, this doesn't make sense. Science is about the truth. The climate change science is now in, it's not controversial. The science is in, yet these science museums are taking money from climate change deniers. So they're confronting museums with public protests, petitions to have climate change deniers removed from their board of governors. But again, this is all coming from outside the traditional museum community, which I find disturbing. I think, if anything, we should be reflecting upon this and taking some initiatives ourselves. But so far, it's been left to outsiders. And I think there are a lot of... Shall I go on for a bit on that? Oh, I've lost your voice.
Sorry, yeah, I just unmuted. There's a bit of delay if you unmute your mic. So,
okay.
Yeah, and I wondered if why is that? Why do you think that? Is it because of fear, or is it there's a lot of money involved behind the scenes, or is it just that sort of business mentality that we don't speak up as much as we should?
Well, yeah, those are all contributing factors for sure, Ryan. And one, to put a fine point on it, I think that museums have become far too prone to influence from sort of marketplace ideology. There are more and more business people on boards of governors now, and they're exercising their influence. And I see that that's now become a concern even in the broader social service sector, that there are more financial types running boards of governors. And the fact is then that the issues of concern become money and very little else. But I think there's also some reasons that are much deeper that have to do with museums just as museums. And first of all, they're insular organizations. I mean, even within the museum community, there's very little real collaboration between multiple museums. Everybody kind of goes at their own, discovers things for themselves, and they have little or no contact not only with other museums but also with non-museum organizations in their communities. I mean, you don't see museums linking up with environmental organizations or with social agencies. So museums, for some reason, are insular. And as a result, they have little or no experience in engaging with broad societal issues and aspirations. They talk to themselves within their own museum, and they talk within the museum community from a position of what I call authoritative neutrality. They're very wary of taking a position on anything, lest they be accused of bias or whatever. But of course that's nonsense, because by maintaining the status quo, you're already adhering to a certain set of values. So they're insular organizations. They have little or no experience or skill in dealing with organizations outside the museum. And I think those are two major factors in response to your question.
And so I guess this is a nice segue to, I've been at the ROM for 9 years. I'm a I'd say to emerging professional, mid-career professional. What can people, we talked a little bit about it before, ask forgiveness, not permission, but, are there things that maybe people listening or watching can do to increase awareness, or become collaborators, not competitors, with other organizations or institutions, local institutions?
Well, I do, and I think that's really an important question. I think it goes back to the very foundation of museums, and I think it's staff getting together and going to the people who are running the place and saying, we need to revisit our mission here. We need to ask why we're doing what we're doing, because if you look at most museum mission statements, by far most of them talk about what they do and how they do it. Sometimes the mission statement will mention who they do it for, but rarely is the word why ever mentioned. And to me, that's absolutely key. So that's all about some kind of planning, whether you call it strategic planning, whether you just call it an institutional-wide conversation. The museum has to start asking in this day and age, in the early 21st century, with all of the challenges that confront us, and with the fact that museums together capture an awful lot of public money, they have a responsibility to start asking why. And that why has to go beyond just educating people and just entertaining people. And I think that once you start asking the word why, then you're going to introduce the possibility and the opportunity for people to exercise their personal agency. And I know I talked about that a little while ago, but it's so important to me, because that's about people taking action in their world and taking action in their workplace based on their own knowledge, beliefs, and concerns. And museums are such free and creative work environments that there's no reason why those personal beliefs and values and knowledge cannot align with institutional purpose and this question of why. I mean, the fit is this there waiting to happen. I think that you and others, museum workers, need to become activists in your museums. And when I say activists, I mean those activities that are undertaken for a purpose bigger than just personal gain or institutional gain. It's about making a commitment to improving the health of the planet. And museums are starting to do this now. The Manitoba Museum in Winnipeg has done the Lake Winnipeg Museum. The Lake Winnipeg was I think it was the World Health Organization, one of those major international organizations, designated that as one of the most endangered lakes in the world. So Manitoba Museum embraced that responsibility and put together this amazing exhibit. I think they involved 18 non-museum organizations in this collaboration, where citizens can actually get involved now in problem solving and solution finding to do something about the destruction of this lake. So that's this notion of becoming activists, right? Embracing a broader view of the world. And that's really too about acknowledging your ecological self. And that's really the wider sense of identity that emerges when your own self-interest includes the natural world. Museums, not just science museums, not just natural history museums, have to start linking nature and culture. You can't separate them. And I think as soon as that starts to happen, there's going to be wonderful opportunities to explore this notion of interconnectedness. And I guess that's all to say is museums really have to become more reality-based. They sort of have to get out of this internal agenda fixation, this insularity, and become more involved in the broader world. They've got to embrace a sense of urgency and see things as they really are in terms of the challenges that we face, such as climate change. And that's all to say is don't wait around to be told what to do, or you're going to be waiting around for a long time. It's time to assume responsibility.
Yeah, I was at a conference a few months back, and I was sat in on a panel, and someone said, what do they call it? Internal insurrection groups, where staff were banding together over an issue and bringing that forward to their managers. And I thought that was a great way to put it.
Was that at a museum conference?
It was, yeah. It was Museum Next in Geneva.
Well, that's fantastic.
The panel was about, it was interesting because the panel was about museum staff and museum work and you know, how you know, museum workers typically are overworked and underpaid and therefore a little bit unhappy maybe, and you know, it wasn't speaking about the same issues we are today, but it was about how to increase happiness of museum workers and talking about people are more happy when they're working on issues that they care about. I thought it was a great little panel. Speaking of panels, at the CMA this past April in Banff, you sat on a panel about climate change, sustainability, and I think the CEO of the Manitoba Museum was there speaking as well about the Lake Winnipeg exhibit. There was another gentleman, I forget his name, from the States, and he was speaking about you know, green certifications and things like that, and the initiatives that he put in place. I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit. You know, about
it's truly remarkable. That's Richard Piacentini, and he's the CEO of the Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Garden. And that is truly a remarkable place, because that's a classic example of an institution that said, why are we doing what we're doing and how can we do it better? And they actually have LEED certified greenhouses, if you can believe it. These are glass houses that are still LEED certified in terms of their reduced carbon footprint. And if they're successful, within a couple of years, they're going to be generating all their own energy themselves. And then they're also thinking about, because they're doing that maybe they're not going to be able to take any more big oil and gas money because it's not compatible with what they're doing. But if you look at that organization, I mean, it's amazing because they've gone through the organization inside out. So, for example, at their restaurants, there's absolutely no junk food. It's just not allowed. It's only healthy food. I mean, that sounds square, but there's a lot of good, healthy food to eat. And the point is that they could have made a lot more money selling junk food, but they're not going to do it because they've adopted this notion of institutional integrity, a fine sense of their obligations. And their obligation, their underscore obligation, is the health of the planet. And that's what they've committed to. So he's really inspirational. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic because there are institutions out there that are embracing this new sense of reality. But when you figure there's almost at least 55,000 museums in the world, there are far too many that have made that commitment. There are far too many that are complacent and happy with the status quo.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I remember Richard talking about it wasn't just a giant leap at the beginning. It was baby steps, and they asked one question why they were doing something, and then it led to more questions and things like that. So it's not like an overnight process. It's something that that's kind of snowballs over time. And if we're thinking about moving in that direction, it doesn't have to be this sort of night and day change.
That's really an important point, Ryan, because it isn't overnight, and once you make this step, it's going to be arduous, but you got to be in it for the long haul, because it's not going to happen overnight. But I still don't think that's not a reason not to take the step.
Mm-hmm. We've got about 13 or so minutes left. I wanted to touch on mindfulness, and I think you've done some presentations and some work on this. Can you just explain for everyone what mindfulness is, how it relates to museums, and why we should be a little more mindful?
Well, I've sort of borrowed it from, I guess from the Buddhist tradition, but to me, I mean, the sort of simple definition is just paying attention, purposely paying attention to things that we ordinarily ignore, including events in the outside world. So if you're being mindful as a museum, you're not only paying attention to what you're doing internally, but you're taking your awareness of the outside world and incorporating that awareness into what you do. In other words, and to repeat again, climate change is a classic example. Museums are knowledge-based public institutions. How can they ignore their role in promoting awareness and solutions to climate change mitigation? If you were mindful, that would automatically begin to happen. And I think that, part of mindfulness too, when I think of mindfulness, I think of three expectations that I have of museums that are mindful. First of all, they have to be open to influence and impact from outside interests, from maybe non-museum interests, from sources outside the museum. And the second thing then is to be responsive to those interests and concerns, not only to ask about them and listen to them, but then also to actually respond. And then the third expectation I have of a mindful museum is to be fully transparent in fulfilling those first two expectations. That is, to be open and to be responsive, and then to be transparent about it. I think those are key parts of mindfulness too. Because I think by doing that, museums will automatically expand their understanding of their own purpose at this point in history, as soon as they start listening to these broader currents.
So, Chapter 6 in Museums in a Troubled World. First edition came out in 2009. It's now 2015, if anyone's keeping track. Just something to think about, for museum professionals going forward, and if people aren't already doing this, something to definitely get on. Bob, you've got a new book coming out soon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's a rare opportunity because my publisher, Routledge, that's published my last 4 museum books, requested that I put together a collection of my selected writings about museums going back 35 years. So I've probably written maybe 125 things, and I had the responsibility and the opportunity to go through and pick out 24 for publication. It's an anthology. It took me a lot longer than I thought, and of course you're reading this stuff and you say, did I write this? How terrible, Or did I write this? That's interesting. Well, anyway, I ended up with 24, and it's organized into 4 different sections. One is about our work in the North with Indigenous peoples. The second section, and each one contains about 6 articles. The second part has to do with organizational change and change management. The third has to do with museums and social responsibility. And the fourth is museums in dangerous times, activism and ethics. So basically what it is, it's a kind of retrospective body of work that starts with my work in the North and my sort of expanding awareness of the role of museums as social institutions and the value that they can really add. So I've got an introduction and those 4 parts, and then it concludes with an epilogue where I put a fine point on the role of museums and their involvement and the involvement I think they should have in climate change. And that book should be due out in December. And thanks for asking about it. I appreciate being able to make a plug.
Yeah, no, it's. I just wanted to get that in there before we close out. I think we're at almost time. Jennifer, Audrey, was there anything that you wanted to add?
No, well, thank you, Bob. It's been quite informative, and I know that you had a really great response at the CMA conference about the issue, and I think it's an ongoing conversation that needs to happen in the museum sector for sure, so an opportunity like this is very good.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you for sending me the valuation. It was quite gratifying.
My pleasure.
I have a question, Bob, to return to the idea about mindfulness in museums and museum work and how museums can remain open to outside world influences. I mean, we know that in a lot of the practices of museums, for example, exhibitions, these are research-intensive, labor-intensive projects that can take many years to come to fruition. So what are some of the steps that you've seen museums take to become more nimble and be able to respond far more quickly to emergent, urgent social issues?
Well, that's a good one, because I think that exhibitions are really sort of old technology. Even though you may introduce, digital technology, I'm not sure that exhibitions are really accomplishing what they need to do, especially as you point out how time-consuming, capital-intensive they are. And now even with most exhibitions, they're still not even authored. So you go into a major institution, you see a major exhibition, and nobody says, well, who did the research? Who wrote this? Why did they do it? What's the purpose? So I really have a lot of difficulty with the persistent approach to museum exhibitions. And I think that museums have a far greater role to play now in forging dialogue and fostering dialogue within the community. For example, again, back to climate change. It's almost become an ideological issue now, especially in the United States, for example, where if you believe in climate change, you are then put in the same camp as anti-abortion, gay rights, etc. The issue is polarized. Well, if you look at a museum that has great public trust, it's centered in its community, it's knowledge-based, it can bring together all sorts of other people, I think that rather than concentrating on an exhibition about climate change, you would bring all these people into a room and start this dialogue to explore the emotional, the intellectual, the political, the economic implications of climate change, rather than doing an exhibition. And I can think of one example. There's a really progressive exhibit museum in Nelson, British Columbia. A small staff, dynamic young woman running this institution. It's called Touchstones. She, when she heard about the Northern Gateway Pipeline, commissioned 2 artists to follow the right-of-way of the pipeline. They did field sketches, came back, and they did an exhibition, but then they also followed it with a whole series of public dialogues and sessions with pro-oil, anti-oil, and citizens. So there you have the best of both worlds. An exhibition to get people's attention, but then a public dialogue to really explore the issues.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah. And also another one would be, say, Fort Calgary. What they've done, they're right on the river, and they have a lot of green space. Rather than doing an exhibition about how things used to be, they've started a community garden. So using volunteers, they now produce garden in this river bottom land that's distributed to the food is distributed to social service agencies throughout the city. So they're true to their historic origin because that fort always had a garden, and now they've reintroduced that. Rather than an exhibition, they've actually got a functioning garden that they're sharing with the community. I mean, I think that the opportunities are only limited by our imagination.
That couldn't agree more, but that's just me. And really getting back to that museum as a forum for dialogue and conversation. amazing. That would be just fantastic. Bob, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and your busy schedule for speaking with us today. On behalf of the ICOM Canada Board, greatly appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure, and thank you, Jennifer, for being on screen, and thank you, Audrey, too.
Nice to see you, Bob. Thanks very much.
Great. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, just some ICOM business. We'll have our next hangout probably the end of summer, early fall. I think Audrey and Jennifer are going to be bringing in the Museo Mix, people from Montreal and possibly Quebec City. Do you guys want to add a little bit about that, or should we do a stay tuned?
Sure. Well, just to give people a glimpse, Museum Mix is, as Bob was saying, the opportunities for collaboration with people from outside and organizations from outside the museum sector. Museum Mix is the greatest example I've seen so far of that. It started in Europe, and it hit Canada a few years ago, more and more participating. So it's really worth the exploration for other museums across Canada. So yes, stay tuned.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.